Hello, D1, and welcome back to our lessons for personal narrative. Today we are doing lesson 11, and in lesson 11, we are going to start our rough draft with our beginning paragraph or our introduction for our personal narrative story. So, for this job, you are going to need your packet as well as a pencil. I'm using a pen just to make sure that you guys can read it nice and easily. So just make sure that you are using a pencil though, so that way you can go back and erase any mistakes that you may make. All right, so we're going to go ahead. We are going to, as we're going through our lesson 11, I want you to go back and look at your moments, making sure that they're the smallest you can make it. Look back at our lesson 4, brainstorm. This is going to help us really. This what happened section is going to be super duper important because this is going to be what our paragraphs are going to be about. So I know number 1 walked through Diagon Alley to get to the ride. Remember, this is on lesson 4, brainstorm. Number 1 is going to be what I write about in this beginning paragraph. So in this beginning paragraph, I'm going to talk about Diagon Alley and walking through it to get to the ride. So this is what I'm going to talk about my beginning paragraph. Whatever you wrote as your number 1 is what you are going to talk about in your beginning paragraph. So that is going to be really helpful as we go along. As well as make sure you go back and you look at your descriptive verbs, adjectives, feeling words, words to replace said. Again, that's going to be really helpful. Any sensory details that we included. Some transition words. Again, you don't have to use all these transition words. We went through and we selected some ones that we really like and think would be helpful. So keep that in mind. Our dialogue as we practice some of our dialogue. Our strong leads. Remember, we talked about 5 different kinds. Jumping into action, a description of our setting, a sound effect, dialogue, meaning the spoken words, words said out loud, and then inner dialogue, what we think in our brain. And then finally, writing a strong ending. This was your job from yesterday, and this is going to help us close our story. But for today, we are starting on lesson 11, which is going to be our rough draft, our beginning. So we are going to be writing 1 paragraph for today's lesson, just 1 paragraph. And so your paragraph has to have at least 5 sentences. If your paragraph does not have 5 sentences, I'm going to send it right back to you. So it needs at least 5 sentences. You guys are 3rd graders. You guys are so smart. I know you guys are capable of it. So 5 sentences, please, for your beginning paragraphs. And you're going to see up here at the top, you are going to see that there are little check boxes up here for you to check off. This is going to help you as you go along to make sure that you are meeting all the criteria to make sure you get that awesome grade, a 3 or higher on your writing. So let's go ahead. You are going to listen and follow along as Miss Walsh gives you an example or models for you how to write an introductory paragraph. And so I'm going to start first things first by indenting my paragraphs. If you remember a while back, we talked about indenting our paragraphs, and this lets our reader know that we are starting a new paragraph and that there's going to be a shift in the story. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to start with my paragraph. I do 2 fingers, so you put 2 fingers down, and this is where you're going to start your first word. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to use my setting description opener because I really liked it as my opener to kind of hook the reader in. So I indented, and I'm going to say, it was as though I have fallen right into the pages of the Harry Potter Some things I want to point out right away is that if I'm using the title of something, so maybe if you went and saw a movie or something and it's the title of a movie or a book or something that you're using in your personal narrative, make sure you have quotation marks around it. That lets your reader know that this is a title. You can also underline it as well. I use quotations though because it's easier to see than an underline. Something I also want to point out is that, yes, Miss Walsh is using a pen, so that way it's really easy for you guys to see her writing. Something I want to keep in mind, as I mentioned yesterday in your strong ending lessons, I want you guys to make sure that you are writing dark, nice and dark, so that way I can read your writing when you post a picture of it on slides. So remember, make sure you're writing nice and dark, so that way Miss Walsh and Miss Lopez can read your writing easily. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to continue. I was in Diagon Alley and the sweet smell of butterbeer wafted through the air. And so here you can see I included a sensory detail. Remember, our sensory details are touch, sight, feel, taste. And so I went ahead and I'm talking about smell now so my reader can imagine what I'm smelling. It felt as if I was truly in London. Hurry up. Let's go, my sister shouted out at me. Again, this is why it's important you guys write with pencils, because Miss Walsh made a mistake. I was able to fix it though. My sister shouted out at me. And as you can see, I already started to include some dialogue. Remember, with our dialogue, we start with quotes around what's being said. And at the very end, we make sure to include a comma, so that way we know that we're continuing on. So I started with the quote. Before I ended my quote with quotation marks, I put a comma, quotation marks, and then I finished what happened, who said, and how they said it. So I didn't just say my sister said. No, she shouted out at me. I was more specific. I snapped out of my state of shock as I saw my mom, dad, and sister make their way towards the most anticipated. I'm gonna move it up. Part of our trip. And as you can see, I'm really using that descriptive language. So I'm not using boring adjectives or boring verbs or nouns. I'm really kind of trying to expand my writing and make it really interesting. So most anticipated, I snapped out of my state of shock. I'm really helping my reader kind of imagine what it is that I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to continue. Next thing I knew, Here I'm using a transition word. I was standing in front of the tall, white, and you can see I'm already finished through this first page. There are more pages, so I'm gonna flip. So next thing I knew, I was standing in front of the tall, white building. Known as Gringotts Bank in the world of Harry Potter. I'm going to again put quotes around it because I'm referring to the title of the story. Sitting right on top of that building was a massive pale gray dragon covered in marks, looking as if he had just escaped the bank. Period. Are you ready? Asked my mom. I exclaimed. Oh, you know I am. And that is going to be the end of the beginning of my paragraph. So again, some just more details I want to point out in my writing is that I really made sure that I described my setting. So I let them know I was in front of this big, tall, white building. I told you the name of it, Gringotts Bank. I also told you about the dragon that was sitting on top, making sure that I was really specific about how it looked. You know, it's a massive pale gray. He has marks on him, looking as if he escaped. And then finally, I finished off with some dialogue that kind of leaves my reader wondering, well, what's going to happen next? Like, I'm ready for what? And so I'm kind of setting them up for the excitement that and letting them feel that excitement that I'm feeling as well. And so I'm going to quickly go back to this front page and I'm going to make sure that I have all of these items checked off, that I included each of these items. So write a strong lead. Well, I used one of the leads from my strong lead page about describing the settings. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check that off. Describe the setting. Yep, I talked about the smell, I talked about where I was, I talked about how the building looked, what was on top of the building, introduce characters. So myself being a character, I introduced myself, I introduced my mom, my dad, and my sister. So I made sure I introduced my characters that are going to be in my story. be mindful of word choice. So again, I'm making sure that I'm using descriptive verbs and adjectives. I'm not using boring words. I'm not saying said a bunch of times. I'm changing it up. Use sensory details. So again, I talked about the smell, some of the things that I was seeing. So using sensory details. Use transitions. I used next thing I knew. And then finally, include dialogue. I included several pieces of dialogue just in the beginning of my story, so I'm going to check that off as well. And so I want you to keep this in mind as you are writing your own beginning paragraph. My paragraph ended up being 8 sentences. Can yours be 8 sentences as well? Of course it can, but remember, you are required to have at least 5. If you have less than 5, I'm sending it right back to you. So go ahead and make sure that you complete that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to message Miss Lopez or myself so we can help you guys. All right, bye D1.